And then we're gonna go live. 3, 2, 1.
Hi, everybody. We are going to be letting folks in the room for the Zoom. And for those of you that are on Facebook Live, welcome. And we hope that you'll share this, start a watch party. There's going to be a lot of communication with links dropped in the chat. So we're excited to have you all as you come together in honor of this election cycle, and we're letting folks in the room. I'm gonna go ahead and admit all and get this show on the road. Welcome as you're coming into the Zoom room. We're also on Facebook Live, so if you go to the North Carolina Council of Churches Facebook page or the North Carolina Interfaith Power and Light Facebook page, it's wonderful to be able to share the feed, put your friends in there, start a watch party, and we're also really grateful that you're here with us on Zoom. So I want to welcome everyone to the 7th event in our Voting Our Values Forum series. My name is Susanna Tuttle. I am the Program Director of NCIPL, the Creation Care and Climate Justice Program of the North Carolina Council of Churches. It is my honor to welcome you today. Before we begin, I want to thank our partners at Vote Earth for supporting this forum series. Please do check out the Vote Earth website. And also, please remember to download and encourage your community to download our Values Voter Guide, Democracy, Values, and the 2020 Election. The North Carolina Council of Churches is the only organization distributing this guide in North Carolina, and we have pledged to distribute 10,000 copies across the state. So please help us continue to get the word out and encourage people to vote on our values of justice and compassion this election season. Today we will be discussing what it means to stand up for LGBTQ rights and to stand with the LGBTQ community members in fighting for those rights. We have with us Mandy Carter of Equality NC, Liam Hooper of Ministries Beyond Welcome, and Michelle Peedin of the North Carolina Council of Churches, here today in her role with LILA Latinx LGBTQ Initiative. Thank you all for being with us. And today you will also get to hear from Javane Skiba of NCIPL. NCIPL has been a long supporter of the North Carolina Council of Churches, and they will speak with us during our voter education segment of this call. We will send out our typical voter educational materials in the email packet sent out this Friday, including a recording of this forum. As you have questions for our speakers during their remarks, please go ahead and place them in the chat, whether you're on Zoom or Facebook Live. We will flag those for our Q&A at the end of the call. Also, if you haven't already, please say hello in the chat. We would love to know where you're calling in from and your organization or faith community so that we can welcome you. Thank you again for being here. And without further ado, let's go to Sarah Ogletree, NCIPL Program Coordinator, who will begin our conversation with our speakers.
Thank you, Susanna. I'm so excited to be having this conversation today. Thank you all for being here. Thank you to our speakers. I'm so grateful to have with us Mandy Carter, the Voter Engagement Strategist of Equality NC, Liam Hooper, the Executive Director and Founder of Ministries Beyond Welcome, and Michelle Peedin, the President of the Board at LILA Latinx LGBTQ Initiative. Really wonderful people. I can't wait to hear from them, and I can't wait for this conversation. As Susanna said, thank you for being with us, and their bios have also been placed in the chat, so please do read more about our incredible speakers today. I want to begin our conversation today with Mandy of Equality NC. And my first question, Mandy, is just to ask, can you tell us a bit about yourself and what working with and for the LGBTQ community has meant to you?
Well, first, before I begin, I want to say a huge thank you for being able to be a part of what's happening this morning. And Liam and I go way back, and Michelle, I'm excited to be a part of this. Before I begin, I want to just take a moment to acknowledge and really frame my remarks around Ruth Bader Ginsburg, John Lewis, and C.T. Vivian when we think about the organizing. I was born November 2nd, 1948. This demographic's important. I'm part of the 74 million World War II baby boomers. And it was in high school in Schenectady, New York. When I was a junior, someone from the American Friends Service Committee came into my high school, 64, 65, and the Quakers ended up going to a AFSC high school work camp in the Pocono Mountains. And it's the first time that I heard the name Bayard Rustin. It's the first time I heard Audre Lorde. But more importantly, having this conversation about LGBTQ, we didn't have those letters earlier, but there was a couple named Guy and Candy Carowin from the Highlander Center in Tennessee that was intentionally established for Black and white folk in Tennessee to have this conversation about justice organizing. And part of that conversation was the importance of the Black church, the importance of faith-based organizing, but more importantly, the importance of voting. So when I frame that, I would say since 1967, I graduated in 1966, I've been very fortunate for the past 53 years to have this as my employment, my kind of vocation, and thinking about what the impact of that is for November 3rd, 2020. I want to give up two numbers that's in key for all of us on this call. If you have not done your census, please get it done. We only have 8 days left for that. That census will determine our lines, congressional lines, for the next 10 years. It's the amount of money we're going to get. So please, if you haven't done that, do that. The other number is 42. That's how many days to November 3rd election. I must say that when I think about this conversation and keeping it in context, as a lesbian out and visible, as a lesbian of color out and visible, I find myself thinking about why this conversation and the power of the vote is key. When these lands were first settled, you think about, it was, with all due respect, who wrote the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution? No women, no people of color. We didn't even have the right to vote. And I know my folk came on boats. We came here as property. So if you think of the journey about how people of color and had to really organize and figure out ways to get the right to vote, but also women didn't have the right to vote either. So I put that in context. If that's the case, here's the demographic about why I told you, what year I was born. If there's 74 million baby boomers, right now, anyone on this Zoom call, and we'll watch it between the age of 18 and 35, you'll be about 1 more million than us. I can count those two numbers together, 18 to 35 and us. That's a huge demographic that we need to think, but also in the context of North Carolina, women are now numerical majority. So I only say that because as we look at mobilizing the power of the vote and what you want to do with it, it's going to be key. Also, Equality North Carolina was really founded back in 1979. I think you had mentioned that, it's in the bio. But what's important about that, we're still here. And thinking about how it went from the Human Rights Foundation to the Pride Pack, and thinking about how important that was for LGBT folk that are elected officials and appointed, because that's who's sitting on your city council, county commissioner, state, going up to federal, but also that's soil and water, and really on the local level. And it would really be important to know who these people are, why they're there, but you might want to run as well in terms of what that might mean, in terms of particularly if you're LGBTQ. There was a time that people would say, you don't need to know about that. I don't want anyone to know about that. But we've come a long way in what you do have to figure out how you are out and visible. Two quick examples. Lawana Mayfield, Black lesbian, ran for the first time ever in Charlotte, was out and visible. She won, never had run before. We now have people sitting over there in the General Assembly, people like Marsha Murray and Bernetta Alston, some people who had to figure out why it's important to be a part of the issue. What I love, Sarah, when I was reading the initial kind of conversation about this, about when you think about how does change happen in this society, it's the only one I know. The changing of hearts and minds, the marches, the poetry, the song, the dance, all the other cultural ways in which we try to figure out how do you shape social justice in all languages and cultures. But if you don't overlay that also with the changing of public policy, and where does policy happen? It happens on the local level, it happens on the state level, and it happens on the federal level. If I would say to you the 4 words why this is key today: United States Supreme Court, United States Supreme Court. All the wins we have gotten might be overturned like that. Or do we keep them? Or do we keep on gaining more? because who sits there makes a difference without getting into any issue about, politics of it all. That said, I want to raise something, and I hope Liam and Michelle, you address this as well. In 2013, we had a major, huge win with Edie Windsor winning that landmark case that ended up defeating Defense of Marriage Act, not gay marriage, marriage equality, because who had to fight for marriage equality? Women first and people of color, Loving versus the state of Virginia. That same Supreme Court all but gutted the Voting Rights Act of 1965. So I would like to ask, as a woman who's of color and who's queer and a lesbian, how did I feel that day? Devastated. And right now, and that's why I had to dedicate it to John Lewis. Over my shoulder, you see that sign, 50 years after Selma, voting rights still matter? On the 50th anniversary of that, I carried that sign across the bridge, the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma, the same bridge that our first ever African-American president won, Barack Obama, and the first family. And I think about that because on that Bloody Sunday, 50 years earlier, people almost got beat to death trying to cross that bridge just to get to Selma for the right to vote. So if you think about the legacy of why that's important and why that matters. So I always keep that. And you notice right next to it, Michelle, it's also because we're now doing a lot of Latinx outreach for voting. We have to make sure we have this in both languages and cultures and how we get to figure out how that important that might be. I would also say, and I want to keep track of the time because I want to give ample time. I'm a little emotional right now. I really am. Because what happened on Friday was a testament about what had to happen for her to even to have that position. And when John Lewis gave his life in C.T. Vivian, I remember the '63 March on Washington. One quick story, 20 years later, when they decided to do every 10 years of that march, the DC Coalition for Black Lesbians and Gays said, we have to have someone who's a Black person who's gay or lesbian on that Lincoln Memorial steps. And it was Audre Lorde. And I'm sitting here thinking about how critical it was. And the initial reaction was, no, we ain't having no lesbian standing on the steps of the state Supreme Court, but she did. But also all those years later, in 2013, it was the National Gay and Lesbian Task Force, Southerners on New Ground, when we were invited to be a part of that coalition. Look at that journey. No, we don't want you all of a sudden, but that didn't happen overnight. That took a lot of organizing, figuring out how we get to be a part of that, the faith-based organizing and the power of one. And that's the difference that it makes. So I'm sitting here, bring it. I mean, we're in a moment and I'm just so happy and proud to be a part of this conversation moving forward. So I'll just end with that and we'll get to the Q&A. And I just have one final thing I want to just say. If I can just make this quote in terms of this, why we should really think about coalitioning. Given what happened with the Edie Windsor case and the dismantling of the Voting Rights Act, for our LGBT community, are we about justice or are we about just us? We're sitting in this moment. And how we address that and what we do about it come November 3rd, 2020 and beyond will make a difference. And I think we're going to do the right thing because it's about all of us collectively as a collective we. Thank you.
Thank you, Mandy, so much, so much. I'm appreciative of what you just said. Are we about justice or are we about just us? I think that, that's true for movements for justice across the board. In the environmental movement, we've been asking ourselves that, are we only for environmental justice or are we for intersectional justice that helps all people, that recognizes that we are all connected? And I'm so grateful for that statement from you. I'm also grateful for your framing around our loss of RBG, the framing around this moment, John Lewis's legacy. We are living in a really powerful time in which we do have to stand up and be loud and be clear about our values and living them out and standing up for them. And I also wanted to just mention, I thought it was really powerful what you named about, a lot has changed as you've been doing this work, and then a lot hasn't. There is so much work that still has to be done. There are wins that we could lose. We have to continue in this work. I want to be sure to, I initially had planned to ask you these questions individually. So do you want me to ask you the second two questions, or did you I felt like you hit all of them, but I also wanted to
Yeah.
make sure that you had your time.
Okay, I just wanted to make sure I was just being conscious of the time for
Sure.
others. So if you want to go ahead and do those, I can do them. I think what happened was I got on a tangent here, and I think I might hit some. But go ahead and finish those other two, because I actually wrote notes for those as well. So.
Oh, you did? Yeah. No, it was wonderful, and you hit all of it. But I did want to give you a chance. Yes. So I just wanted to ask these other two questions. So you're a co-founder of Equality North Carolina. And I've read about Equality NC. You mentioned some of your background with the formation of the North Carolina Human Rights Fund in 1979 and then the NC Pride PAC in the 1990s. And I just wanted to ask if you could speak further to the work of Equality NC and what you all are currently doing to protect the rights of LGBTQ folks in the state.
Yeah. Well, actually, because in fact, we have an interesting kind of partnership right now with Southerners on New Ground and Equality in North Carolina. But right now, it's all around the elections and giving people the information needed, which is, I'm so happy that you're having your voter guide. Because we live in North Carolina, what we have at stake right now, and without getting into the who, but what the issues are and what what's at stake in terms of November 3rd. It's all the way from the federal elections, the presidency. It goes down to the state level, the council of state. It goes to the judges. It goes to city council members. It goes to, all the way down to soil and order, Department of Education. So what Equality is trying to figure out is who are they, what are the issues, and why it would be relevant actually to two communities. It would be the LGBTQ communities and what's at stake. For instance, there has been this, if you remember not long ago, there was this, what was it called? No on One or something around bathroom bill, access to bathrooms, whether trans or not, and how we had to organize, and thanks to people like the Reverend William Barber and others. So anything to do with, where you live, job employment, discrimination, anything to do with your livelihood really could make a difference between whether you can be discriminated legally or not. So Equality in North Carolina has really been an active advocate for that issue. I think the other one really would be important is environmental issues. In fact, if I would say to you, if you went up 10,000 feet high and asked a question, clean air, clean water, no one homeless, no one hungry, everyone having access to healthcare and an education, it doesn't matter whether you're LGBTQ or not. It's almost like what's going to be the best for the citizens of the state of North Carolina. I think the other one is voter protection. In the time of COVID, we're very concerned about how people have a right to vote, access to the ballot, access to information in English and Spanish, which really is important. So I think it's knowing what the issues are and protecting the right to vote on those issues, which would be key. So that's a lot of what Equality is figuring out what to do right now in all of our 100 counties. So I think that would be the best way. And I put the web link in there if people want to go to that and they can get some more information to be engaged. So that's the best way I could answer that.
Thank you so much. My last question is just maybe in a couple of sentences, what is on the line? And you've named this with the Supreme Court. What is on the line in this election cycle?
Well, actually, and this is interesting. I mean, in one way, if you think about it, this is what's so interesting about what just happened, not just with RBG, but also state courts and why it matters. If you get a win, you would hope that you never have to revisit it. Let's be honest, a woman's right to choose is on the line. Any of our LGBTQ and ability to have a job and have a home and all the other kind of insecurities. And I think COVID has actually exacerbated the situation more than ever. I feel very fortunate. I live alone in my home. I'm in day number 183 of North Carolina Safer at Home. What happens when you have people have parents and children in school or doing care for their parents or their grandparents, and LGBTQ withstanding or people of color? This is the issue of the day. But here's what gives me hope, though, and this is the thing that I'm most excited about. Despite all of the kind of trauma and drama that we're going through, we really figure out how we end up having this collective conversation and how we actually can be in community and coalition with each other, and thinking about the hows, the ways, and where, and more importantly, as we hear from Michelle and also from Liam, and what you're going to do about it, and how, and most importantly, the power of one. each and every one of us has the potential to figure out how we want to impact change if we so choose to use it. So I'll end there. I feel very hopeful, very hopeful. Glad to be here.
Thank you so much. Yes, I appreciate that call to hope and reminder of hope and the power of all of our voices when we come together. It's so important. Yeah, now I have some questions for Liam. And Liam, my first question for you is the same question that I asked Mandy, which is, can you tell me a bit about yourself and what working with and for the LGBTQ community means to you?
Hi, Sarah. Thank you. And thank you, Mandy. It's great to be here with all of you. It's great to see Michelle, too. I feel always really awkward when I talk about myself, so I'm going to try to do that with some modicum of maybe interest and intelligence. I was born in 1963. And on one level, that may seem like so, but that time and the events that shaped my formative years really cannot be separated from how I view justice and how I view justice work and injustice. It just cannot be. And so one of the things that growing up in the period I grew up in the South mostly, taught me was that my existence is deeply tied to the existence of those who went before me, right? So my ability to have this conversation with you is owes allegiance to my ancestors. And when I say my ancestors, I refer to my own lineage, but also to my gender transcendent ancestors. I am a person who was born with the assumption of being a female. So I was, in my coming up years, I discovered I was lesbian by default, right? That was just the assumption because the world perceived me as female. And I also grew up in a period where discerning that you were different from the gender assigned to you at birth was deeply traumatic. I was taken to, see psychiatrists and was medicated, and I was sort of brainwashed in my treatment, right? Like, you are a girl, and hear this language is very important. You will always be a girl, and you need to accept that and be happy about it. Not you're a female or a woman, but you are a child, right? You are a girl. You will always be a girl. That is who you are. And therefore, you will always need people bigger than you and above you to tell you who you are and to validate you and affirm your personhood. And, oh, by the way, you don't really know anything, because here we are having to tell you who you are, right? And you can never trust your own instincts. But at the same time, you can't trust these people who are bigger than you and have power over you. So in the turbulent times we were growing up in, those were also the messages I was getting at the tender age of like 6, right? So all of that impacts justice for me and how I view it. And it impacts my work with my community, which first and foremost is transgender people. So I owe my ability to be here to those who went before me and paid for my spot with their lives. Like Sylvia Rivera, who I had the biggest crush on growing up, by the way. I mean, I'll just come out and say so. Marsha P. Johnson, right? And even people like Audre Lorde. I was reading Audre when I was in high school, and no one, that I hung out with knew who she was, right? And her whole concept of how the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house really resonated with me, and it informed the influence I had by many of my mother's friends. I was kept around a lot of women. My mom belonged to this sort of social sorority, not a college sorority. And many of her friends were people who had immigrated here from places that were going through some hard times, like Philippines and places like that. But also many of her friends were women who were Holocaust survivors. And one of them, Helena, used to say all the time, this really impacted me: be careful what freedoms you give up, because before you know it, you've given up them all. And so that informs all of my work, right? And for me, in addition to being, you know, like kind of a radical among my peers most of the time, you know, I tend to be a lot more on the fringe of the liberal, right? But all of that influences even how I do things like gardening and woodworking, right? Like I do it with an eye to environmental injustice and how there's such a thing as environmental racism and how there's such a thing as a link between the appropriation and abuse of land and resources and the appropriation and exploitation of bodies, right? So all of that is stuff I carry with me, and also try not to take up a lot of white space or a lot of male space. So what I want to say really pointedly is some stuff I wrote down so I wouldn't go down rabbit trail. For me, working with the LGBTQ community means first knowing that I'm an outsider in that community and that my people are often an outsider in that community. Therefore, I have to work to be the most authentic and honest version of myself that I can be so that I can continue to, you know, make mistakes, keep striving, learn from my mistakes, hear others, be in conversation with those who don't have the relative privileges that I have, and be the best accomplice and co-conspirator for justice that I can be, right? So it also means honoring and respecting that we're not one homogenous community, and we're really not a community. We're collections of very diverse communities, right? Plural. And that therefore, I have to be mindful of the fact that gender justice by nature and demand is intersectional justice and must address intersectional power, that you cannot separate the two. And all of that awareness and disposition to my work and even to how I try to live and move and have my being in the world comes out of my formation, right? So being in community with the LGBT community means being in relationships, staying at the table, continuing to have courageous and hard conversations, and always working to decolonize the conditioned, culturally trained oppressor in myself first, and then working outward from that. So I see it all as formative work for myself and then for the communities that I'm engaged in.
Thank you, Liam. Thank you for your vulnerability and for your naming again of intersectionality, both you and Mandy. I'm so grateful for that that intersectional justice, for naming the ways that this is all connected, that for naming gender justice, for naming environmental racism, for naming multiple identities, being white, being male, being trans. There's so many things that come into who we are and to our stories. And I'm grateful for all that you just helped us in locating the work and how you see justice and do justice, which I have known Liam for a while, I will say that, and I have been a witness, a grateful witness to your work of justice. So thank you for all that you do and for being here again. My next question is about your organization, Ministries Beyond Welcome. And this is really how I got to know Liam, was through this organization. So Liam, you are the founder of Ministries Beyond Welcome, an organization whose mission is to affirm, honor, and celebrate the inherent worth, vitality, and indomitable spirits of transgender and gender nonconforming persons and communities through education, community building, organizing, and collaborative engagement. And I know that you also do a lot of work with faith communities in this. So I wanted to give you an opportunity to speak more to your work and to what Ministries Beyond Welcome offers faith communities and trans and gender nonconforming people.
Thank you, Sarah. So really, that's what Ministries Beyond Welcome does, right? But also, and I have to also say thanks for recognizing that, you know, all of this makes me a bit emotional in the light of I'm still not okay from losing John Lewis, you know, and then here we are, you know, with the notorious RBG. So and all this work feels so urgent to me, and it has driven the inception of Ministries Beyond Welcome. And where I say I'm the co-founder, I think I want to make clear that I'm not some, white guy sucking up power, right? Like that, really what I did was just help give us a name and a forum for this sort of cooperative work that my peers and I do. And my position as a male blending and to some degree white blending person affords me, right, to make space for them. So we're a coalition of trans, or what I refer to as gender transcendent persons of faith. The majority of the people who are part of the team at Ministries Beyond Welcome, and we're a team, so we actually try to practice what we're asking folks to do, which means that we're not a hierarchy, we're not a top-down. We believe in power sharing and consensus and teamwork and team building and coalition building and community building. So we try to do that first with ourselves, and then with the people we try to partner with and consult with and help facilitate their learning. All of that we try to do with a values-based, face-forward, and a trauma-informed praxis, right? So recognizing that we're all people of faith in some way, we also recognize we were formed in those faith systems that are not by nature very kind to us. And so we also recognize and came to be largely because the South in particular, it's true everywhere, but the South in particular is an interesting space in that it is religion dominant, right? Whether it claims that or not, much of the formation of everything from the colonization of and the land theft of this country and the exploitation of bodies in this country harkens back to religious justification and the manipulation of religion to justify horrific colonizing and imperialist behavior, right? So, and I'm not talking about party or anything, I'm just speaking truth, right? This is what happened. And so we recognize that to change hearts and minds, and then be able to create a groundswell that drives change in terms of policy and systems and structures and institutions, we have to be able to speak to people from their core beliefs, right? From what they at least think is their value system and the value system in which they've been trained, and respond to that with some correction, right? So a lot of what we do at Ministries Beyond Welcome is aimed at demythologizing bad translations of texts, and how we translate sociopolitically our continued belief that these texts that were written prior to the Common Era or being formed in the first century of the Common Era should influence our lives. And if so, how and in what ways and from what perspective, right? So we also interrogate, how do we read those texts and how do we read and interpret this idea of religion versus faith, perhaps, right? And the call to be in community together. So the work that we do is centered around a lot of education, but comes from the perspective of courageous conversation, right? And community building and staying at the table. And so our goal, if we work with a congregation or a faith group, is to build a relationship that lasts, that we keep coming back, right? And we keep widening and widening circles of enlightenment, in rethinking about how do we view this thing we call God? How can we then come together and have conversations about it and discern together how we live and move and have our being in a world where the presence of God is assumed, right? Like, what does that call us to do? And so we each have different gifts. So we all come from varying faith traditions. I'm the only Jew on the team so far. And as you know, Sarah, I was once a UCC ordained minister. I was the first openly transgender person to be ordained by my association in the UCC. So because I believe faith and life and everything else, and gender even, is a journey, and sexuality is a journey, I ended up over time, after several years of living as a Jew, discerning that the reason I sort of stunk at being a Christian was because I wasn't one. And, that just didn't work for me. And it didn't comport itself and align itself with my understanding of God experientially and with human beings who show me the face of God, right? So my peers come from all kinds of backgrounds, and we're multiracial, multicultural. We're just very pluralist all around because we're committed to intersectional justice. And this is how we do this work, chipping away hearts and minds and creating what I hope is a wider embrace and a bigger community. This stuff makes me emotional, Sarah. I'm sorry.
Oh, it makes me emotional too. Thank you for your vulnerability again, and thank you for sharing your story so generously. I think that's really a gift. It's such a gift to hear your story, to hear the stories that we're hearing today, and to be welcomed into your life in this way. And I'm really grateful for that. I also just want to highlight how important it is that we do decolonize our faith. Last week's call, we had a conversation about racial justice and restorative justice with Kalia Martin and J.C. Woodley. And Kalia talked a lot about decolonizing faith, particularly faith, the Christian faith tradition, and the way that Christianity has been used as a weapon repeatedly against Black folks, against brown folks, and obviously against people of different gender identities and of different sexualities. So yes, we have to look at our texts. And then we also know, just as someone who has done a lot of theological I have a master's of divinity, and I read a lot of queer theology in my program. I know from my peers that my LGBTQ peers in those programs, who are beautiful pastors, beautiful faith leaders, had a lot of internalized homophobia. And going into those texts and seeing themselves again, making those texts, looking at them anew, and being able to see themselves as a whole human, entirely loved by God, was such a beautiful and healing thing for them and the people that they serve today. So I'm grateful for how Ministries Beyond Welcome can play a role in that as well, and for everything that you just named. It is so important that we see ourselves as the Imago Dei, that we are made in God's image for those of us who are people of faith and who ascribe to the Judeo-Christian faith tradition. Yes.
I don't want to run over my time, but I do want to answer your third question.
We can do it quick. We can do it quick.
So
we're gonna be okay.
I'm too fundamental because I want to hear from, I really want to hear from Michelle. And I don't want to take up a lot of white space, right? But I do want to say this. I have two core beliefs that I think influence what's at stake in this election. And one is that we are already free. Every single one of us. We were born into freedom. What we have failed to achieve is the liberation to live into and actualize that freedom in terms of our own selfhood, in terms of our own sense of purpose and belonging and thriving in the world, and our own innate interdependence with everyone and everything else, right? Everything is connected. Nothing happens in isolation, in full independence, but rather in interdependence. And so, with that in mind, what I think is at stake in this election is the profound difference between the oppressive myth of democracy we've been conditioned and trained to believe exists, and the creation of the collective, responsive, and responsible democracy we've been daydreaming about and believing that we live in spite of living in evidence every day that it doesn't exist, right? So, said another way, seeking justice, while also flourishing in relative comfort, security, and safety, while the lives of others hang in the very imbalances that create inequitable comfort in the first place, is not only not freedom, it's to be enslaved by the myths of personal exceptionalism and individual self-sufficiency. Said another way, my liberation depends on your liberation. Your liberation depends upon mine, and the recognition that none of us is complete or fully human or humane without each other, right? And that ultimately I am because others were. I am because others not only birthed me, but formed me and cared for me. And that is true for every single one of us, right? It's true for our environment. It's true for everything around us. And that ultimately, I believe, is what is at stake, because the moment we forget that our true liberation, our ability to live into our innate freedom and interdependence, is not the real issue. It's the moment that we become enslaved, right? It's the moment that we keep building the master's house bigger and bigger and bigger with the same old tools and the same old tropes, when what we deserve is better and more just. I think that's the way I want to say it.
Thank you, Liam. Thank you so much. So we're not going to have time probably for Q&A, but we are going to have time for hearing from Michelle and from Javane, and that's going to be wonderful. So Michelle, thank you for being with us. I'm sorry I muted myself. My first question for you, Michelle, is the same question I've asked everyone. Just can you tell us a bit about yourself and what working with the LGBTQ community means to you?
Thank you, Sarah. I'm going to try to keep this as short as possible. But I'm on the board of LILA, and it is not my full-time job, but I do it in my spare time. It's a pretty new organization. We really started getting going the past 2 or 3 years. And so it's very grassroots, it's very organic. And the majority of us that are working with LILA are doing this voluntarily. But a little bit about myself. I was born and raised in Hillsborough, North Carolina, and to a lovely Peruvian immigrant, a Peruana. My mom immigrated here when she was in her 30s, and my father is from Raleigh, North Carolina. So this is important because it's really shaped my reality and my experience. So I grew up in a biracial, bilingual, bicultural household and family orientation, and predominantly Catholic. So my reality is very much accustomed to straddling multiple worlds and code switching depending on who I'm talking to and the room I walk into. And, you know, being biracial, bicultural, bilingual is both a blessing and a curse, right? It's a blessing because my experience, my life, even just who I am, my makeup is complex and chaotic sometimes and diverse, right? It's also difficult because you don't ever quite feel like you fully belong in any one place. So my dog is snoring in the background, I apologize. So I came out when I was 14, and I'm just a little bit younger than my other panelists. And so what I do like to remind so many of us on the call is that, you know, homophobia and acceptance in families and struggling with faith and things like that is happening today. It's happening in the last 10 years, last 20 years. When I came out when I was 14, I thankfully didn't really struggle with my own sexuality, but I knew without even ever having a conversation directly with my parents and my extended family that it was not going to be accepted. You know, as a child growing up, you pick up on things and you know that your parents or your extended family or church is not talking about certain things, right? There's no representation around gay marriage or trans people or anything like that. And then in addition to that, you pick up on conversations and gossip and things like that, that is nasty, you know, it's hurtful, it's destructive of other people. So growing up believing that I want to treat others the way I would like to be treated, I knew to accept myself. But coming out, it was a very difficult high school experience. And at one point, we all kind of came to a crisis, and it was kind of a breaking point for my immediate family. And my mom kind of pushed me into confession with the father at our Catholic church. And I'm 15 years old and sobbing, and I walk in there and I looked at the father and I said, you know, I know that you're going to tell me I'm going to go to hell. I've heard it before. And he looked at me and he said, I'm not going to tell you that. I'm not going to tell you that because God is omniscient. God is larger and bigger and all-knowing. way beyond what your parents as humans, as flawed human individuals, can see and understand and can love you. And I just was not expecting it. And that one conversation is the only reason that I didn't give up on faith. I didn't give up on religion. And that is why years and years later, when I was searching for my own faith, I stumbled upon, shout out to United Church of Chapel Hill, representation and symbols. Those matter as much as like flags and rainbow feel silly and celebratory. It matters. It's the only reason I walked into that church, is because there was a big rainbow sign that said, all are welcome here. And that is where I was introduced also to the La Mesa service that they have there. Pastor David Mateo, I'm so grateful for him, because years later when I'm sitting in the back of this La Mesa service and I'm in a church and I'm among Latinx immigrants around me, and we're talking openly about gay marriage and justice, and we're talking about it in Spanish, I just wept. I just cried. I had no idea. I had absolutely no idea that faith communities were focusing on justice. I had no idea that there were communities, Latinx communities, that were talking openly about LGBTQ issues and people and affirming. I just didn't know that these communities existed. And that's when I realized how alone I had felt for so many years. So now with LILA, I think, you know, to your question of what does it mean to me to work with the LGBTQ community, it's everything I had dreamed of. I really wanted to be the person. I wanted to be part of something that I was missing as a teenager. You know, when you have the opportunity to step into the role of the person you needed back then I took that role and did the best I can. So it's truly hopeful. It's a blessing. I'm thankful, and yes, I'm humble more than anything.
Thank you for sharing your story. It is a beautiful, beautiful story, and I'm grateful and honored and humbled to hear it. And just thank you for sharing all that you did. Very powerful. Yes, Mandy, it's very powerful. That's the right word. I also want to ask you, Michelle, a bit more about LILA. So the LILA Latinx LGBTQ initiative, you are the president of the board. And I love this explanation on your website. Your website explains that LILA was born out of a need for an organization to support and empower the intersectional LGBTQ plus Latinx and or undocumented community in North Carolina. And this specific community brings about its own set of obstacles and celebrations, some related to healthcare, legal status, language barriers, etc. So again, this conversation has been incredibly intersectional. And can you speak more to the intersectionality of your work and how LILA is striving to meet the needs of the LGBTQ Latinx community in the Triangle?
Yeah, so I don't think that none of us can have this conversation without that intersectionality. And I'm hoping that everyone on the call understands intersectionality, right? So it's not, you know, a Latinx LGBTQ community isn't only experiencing homophobia and transphobia or racism. It's all in one, right? And so this is the intersection of racism, homophobia, transphobia, classism, discrimination based on legal status, which all influences the greater risk of language and access barriers. We have work and economic insecurity, housing insecurity, which also rolls into food insecurity, health inequality. I mean, we're just up against a lot, right? And that's all the external systemic oppression that we're dealing with, and not to even mention the internal community, right? When Latinx and LGBTQ people come to North Carolina, land in the United States, you're adjusting culturally with the language. But then in addition to that, you know, in the greater Latino community, you're experiencing, you know, not acceptance because of homophobia and transphobia, because of deep-rooted faith, because of deep-rooted the pressure to fulfill traditional gender roles and expectations. These masculine and feminine roles are very deeply entrenched in the Latino community. You have machismo that is present in our straight community, but in addition to our LGBTQ community. So in the greater Latinx community, where, you know, LGBTQ people aren't feeling accepted. And then you flip it, and in mainstream LGBTQ community, it has been difficult. You experience racism, you experience language barriers. So it's really this, again, going back to this feeling of not feeling like you have a home, essentially. So that's the biggest thing that I think LILA does, is we do intergenerational and multicultural healing through love, acceptance, and community. And I think that community aspect is without a doubt the most important part. We celebrate both the Latinx celebrations. What does that look like? That looks like food and dancing and language and traditions and faith. But then also we celebrate the LGBTQ culture, right? We have pride, and we have celebration of weddings and celebration of children and adoptions. I mean, it's all so, we're meshing together these celebrations. So it's not, like I said, there's some challenges and there's celebrations. But LILA specifically, we offer support groups, and resources. So our director, Alex Cordova, is also on the call today. Huge shout out to him. He does so much of this work. He's connecting us to resources, mental health resources, reduced cost health clinics. And all of these resources that we're connecting people to have to be open and affirming. They have to offer Spanish languages. They don't always, but that's what we're seeking. That's the nuance of this work. We're connecting people to open and affirming faith communities, and where it is safe to look for jobs. And information about AA, for example, a very short story. You know, we hear these tragic tragic stories that happen to trans women all over the world. But here in North Carolina, we had a trans woman who was approached by a doctor and said, you know, if you want to, you know, create the body that you see for yourself, I can help you. And she had injections done in her butt. And years later, she started experiencing health issues. And she went to a doctor with support from LILA. And we found out that she had most likely been injected with something resembling vegetable oil. And it has really made her health deteriorate. So LILA, like I say, community, we're there to support people, even in these moments where there's not a lot we can do other than just be there with them, sit with them, let them heal, bring, you know, supplies to them. And Alex traveled with her to get that procedure done to help clean out and heal her. But we also do Friendsgivings. It's as simple as, you know, celebrating La Posada, which is faith communities, and celebrating weddings, and then local fundraisers. A lot of it is organic. A lot of it is very interpersonal. Yeah, we also do, let me just make sure to mention this really quickly. We do international work, and that is so important, especially for the importance of voting for policies, because we've traveled to Honduras and Guatemala and have plans to travel to Latin America to offer support and empower the local LGBTQ centers there, because that is the solace for so many of those people in Central America and South America. And there used to be a position at the United States Embassy in Honduras that was dedicated to the human rights of LGBTQ people there, and there no longer is that office. So the people we are voting for impact the human rights of other countries as well.
Thank you, Michelle. Thank you for all the work that you all are doing, all the work that LILA's doing, and the way that you accompany people. I think that is ministry. That is to accompany someone in a journey, to accompany someone to a doctor's office, to dance with, to laugh with. I had the immense privilege of attending a Friendsgiving that LILA put on, and there was a lot of dancing, and I was sore for like a week. It was wonderful. It was beautiful, beautiful community. Maybe in a sentence, what is the importance of voting this election from your perspective, Michelle?
Yeah, I think voting is essentially voting. You have to vote your values. I'm not going to go into them, but between temporary protective status, asylum seekers, immigration, I just have to name these two women, the two trans women who've died in the past year and a half in ICE custody, Joana Medina Leon and Roxana Hernandez Rodriguez. Those two women, you know, between, I'm just naming essential workers. We know how important Latinos are in essential workers right now, caring for COVID patients, and yet they have restrictions that are taken away, their ability to have stimulus checks, receive stimulus checks, and funding for unemployment is not offered to them. There's a lot on here that I'm trying to skip through, but I think voting is putting your faith into action. I think we've talked about how voting is local, state, and federal, but I would also say, I think, we don't realize that voting really is when we have a conversation with a friend, a family member over the kitchen table, when we stand up for injustice in our churches and our neighborhoods and our organizations. Those are all impacting the way our friends and our families and our communities are going to vote, whether we realize it or not. So every moment is that ministry of raising justice for all of us. And I would also say, I know a lot of people on this call are probably already on the LGBTQ rights train. So what I would like to urge you to do is reach out to the people in your communities who are Latinx, who are LGBTQ, who are immigrants, create spaces where they can speak up. Where they can speak up, because in my experience, Latinx, LGBTQ immigrants and undocumented people are more than happy to talk and to share their story. And I think that that's where we're going to change hearts and minds, is by getting to know people. And that's going to change the votes, is getting to know people, loving people, and sharing their experience.
Thank you. What I hear from you is that this is about loving each other well. This is about loving each other well. Thank you so much for that. I'm now really excited to give a couple minutes to Javane Skiba of NCIPL about their voter outreach program, and then we will close with a blessing and a call for next week.
Well, thank you so much, Sarah, for having me. And I definitely want to thank everybody that spoke on this call for your vulnerability, for your compassion. Yeah, definitely moved to tears a couple times. And just as Michelle mentioned, putting that faith into action and using your voice in voting is so important. And just really quickly, at NCIPL, we've started a project, Vote for NC Kids, where we have engaged nonprofits across the state to help educate and empower their clients and their members through voter engagement. And we are trying to extend that as far as we can reach, and thought this was just a great opportunity to share our digital pledge at ncchild.org/vote, where you can share this and engage people who are unlikely voters, to make that connection that Michelle mentioned, to make that connection that Mandy mentioned, as her sign behind her says 50 years after Selma. And as Liam mentioned, that group of people that were his community, that his mother was a part of, and how they poured into him, like all of these threads are interconnected in how we approach our vote. And all of this is about community and engaging. So I think this pledge is just an easily accessible way to reach out into your communities and take the pledge, engage people, empower them, knowing that their voice is their vote. And, you know, it's an act, as Michelle said again, of like acting out your faith. So again, it's ncchild.org/vote. It's shareable on social media. Tell your friends. It's just great that you guys offered me just this little bit of space. I so appreciate it, because it's been so powerful to hear these stories and be a part of this. So thank you for having me.
Thank you, Javane, and we will include all of, we'll include the pledge and any other information in our packet that we send out on Friday. So please, everyone, do sign the pledge. We know that all of these issues are interconnected, and that caring for children is a big part of what it means to advocate for LGBTQ rights. We have to care for all children and for our LGBTQ children. With that, thank you all for being present to this conversation, for listening to these stories that were so powerful. I'm so appreciative of all that I've learned in this past hour, and of just having the opportunity to be with you all of our speakers. Thank you to Mandy and Liam and Michelle. I do want to ask that you all please do plan to attend our forum next week. It's our last forum in our 8-week series. Next week is the last forum. It will wrap up our Voting Our Values series, and we will have speakers who will speak about nonviolence, peace, and intersectional justice. Those will include the activist and musician David Lamont, the founder of the Wild Goose Festival, Gareth Higgins, Reverend Rodney Sadler of McMinn, Pastor Letitia Godette of the AME Zion Church, and Will Calloway of Vote Earth. So we have a really incredible group of folks next week, and we do hope that you will join us for that call as well. I asked Liam to please close us in a blessing, so we will now close in a blessing, and I hope that your days are beautiful.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Mandy. Thank you, Michelle. Thank you, everyone on the call. It's such a joy to be with you, and thank you for holding space for my emotional state. In honor of Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, I would like to share with you a Hebrew blessing that's very almost secular. Sim shalom tova uvracha chaim chem v'chesed barachamim, which translates as, grant peace, goodness, and blessing, life, graciousness, kindness, and compassion. Shalom.
Amen. Thank you, Liam. Everyone, yeah, thank you all so much.
Thank you.
So grateful for you all being here. Thank you for joining.
Mm.